Entertainment Network. This episode is actually going to air on August 5th, I believe, but this video will probably be seen on the Project Entertainment Network Patreon, and if you happen to be watching live on Twitch when it comes on, the video won't be saved very long because we're going to have it as a exclusive for Project Entertainment Network. So you're going to see me recording an episode. Not normally, about half the time I do interviews, half the time I do topics that I'm talking about. Today I'm going to be doing a reading, and I'll obviously explain all that so in the actual recording, so that won't you don't have to hear it all twice. This microphone is not hooked to this. The sound is actually just coming through the phone for a live feed. So if it turned out that this was awful, then no one's going to see it. But if it's at least the audio can be heard, then you'll be able to hear it on Project Entertainment Network's Patreon page. The actual recording of the podcast is going through a separate system, so that sound is different. So you're going to see my process for actually recording and what that looks like. If I'm doing an interview, typically I'll record the introduction separately, just record the interview itself, and then the introduction, the interview, and then of course all the sound effects and music and all that from bumpers and everything, the ads and stuff will be attached in later. Here, since I'm just doing one through, I do the introduction with the actual podcast. There'll be pauses where the music would go and that sort of thing. So as soon as I hit record here, I'm going to ignore all of you and go ahead and begin with my podcast recording. I hope you enjoy it. You found the Matters of Faith podcast on Project Entertainment Network with your host, Jay Wilburn. This is episode 131. It should be airing the day that I'm coming back from Scares That Care, so it had to be recorded in advance. While it Scares That Care, I think I'm going to pick up an interview or two, which will be heard later in September. But this is being recorded in July, but will be airing during that Scares That Care time that I wouldn't be available to actually take on the recording time. So few interviews and things were recorded in advance, and this will be one that kind of plugs in. I'm going to do something a little bit different today. Before I get into that, want to remind everyone that you can advertise on Project Entertainment Network. If you go to the projectentertainmentnetwork.com website, you can click on the advertising button. You can have Armand Rosamelia's email address there, and you can contact him directly about the deals that you can get for multiple episodes or recording across multiple shows. I believe we have somewhere around 18 or 20 active shows on Project Entertainment Network right now, and you can advertise on any one of those, and Armand Rosamelia would be happy to let you know which of those shows best suits your audience. And of course, as the host of the Matters of Faith podcast, I would be happy to advertise your passions with our audience as well. Podcasting is a great way to advertise because the commercials are evergreen, meaning that new people will pick up on an episode many months afterwards, so you get the initial bump of people who listen, and then from every day going forward, new listeners come on and hear your commercial all the time. So especially if you have a product or service that's available online, podcasting is an excellent way to go with your advertising. So thank you for listening to that, and we will now get into the rest of the episode. This is the Matters of Faith podcast on Project Entertainment Network with your host, Jay Wilburn. Today I'm going to be doing something a little bit different. I'm going to be reading part of my story from the Project Entertainment Network Penn Presents My Favorite Story. There are stories in here from authors such as Chuck Buda, Thomas R. Clarke, Frank Edler, Amber Fallon has one in here, Christopher Golden does, Brian Keene has a story in here, Jonathan Mayberry, Armand Rosamelia, Kelly Owen, James A. Moore, Mary Sangiovanni, John Urbansick, who I think is one of the greatest short story writers of all time, and then myself and many others. Please don't be upset if I didn't name you. We're trying to get on with the episode here. It's a great anthology in that each author/podcaster picked their favorite story to share with the audience. The proceeds go to help the network, and then some money goes to the authors as well. So I guess that's as good a cause as any, right? You can get this My Favorite Story podcast author anthology from Amazon, so check that out. Also, if you go to the Project Entertainment Network website, you can check out the book there as well. Now, I'm going to read part of my story. Some of it you'll have to buy the book to see the rest of it, but some of my favorite stories from the anthology are the ones that come from the other authors. But just wanted to do a special episode here where I shared some of that story, and then we'll probably talk about it a little bit depending on time. This one is called Short Straw by myself, Jay Wilburn, and it's a science fiction story, and one of the reasons it's my favorite is because it kind of has an old school science fiction feel. I didn't get it right the first time, but after the story was rejected, I got some feedback from some editors, and the changes I made it a stronger story, I think, and I got good pay for it, and I was happy to share it again here in this anthology. So it's one that I feel particularly strongly about. I think it's a high watermark with my storytelling. So I'm happy to share it with you now. Again, this is Short Straw by Jay Wilburn. Mr. Gage sat the three boys down on the stone floor as their mother continued the preparation. He mixed the toothpicks in his palms and then carefully spread them out between his thumb and index finger so each one appeared to be the same length. Donovan picked first. He was 14 and he was the oldest. He drew out a complete pick and breathed easy. Adam was 12 and only 1 year older than Michael. He looked at his younger brother and then back at his father's hands. He shook his head. "I can't do it, Michael. You pick." Mr. Gage held the two remaining sticks closer to Adam's face. "Come on, son. Come now, son. This is how we decide. I need to be alive for farming once the world is healed, or I would do it myself. I might not live long enough to do the job. It falls to one of you, and this is how we decide fairly." Adam's eyes widened. "I can't. This is too big." Donovan crossed his arms. "You have to. I picked." Michael reached up and snagged the pick on the left. The concealed end slid out from his father's thumb. It was splintered, and it was half the length of the one Donovan picked. There was no need for Adam to pick. He covered his mouth as he stared at Michael's hand. Michael cussed and threw the broken piece of wood onto the stone floor. Mr. Gage stuck the remaining intact toothpick into his teeth. "Boys, leave me alone with Michael for a time." The other two boys hesitated as their youngest brother glared at the floor. They stood up and walked over to assist their mother across the room in silence. Michael heard his mother let out a sob. He closed his eyes. Mr. Gage placed his hand on his son's shoulder. "I'm glad it was you." Michael lifted his head and stared at his father with reddened eyes. The toothpick bobbed in the man's teeth as he moved his lips. "I don't mean that I wish this on you, but you are up for it. You may not think you are, but you are. I know you're mad and upset, but you had the courage to act, and that's why it is best for you. You will save our family and probably the entire planet." Michael looked down at the short pick on the floor. "Son, we have but a few days remaining. I'll need to explain how things work here, so you can do it on your own. I've been writing furiously for weeks, knowing this moment was coming for one of you. I've left detailed diagrams and instructions, but we need to walk through the processes so that you know them in your bones. Everything must be done exactly right, and different decisions have to be made at critical moments. I'm also going to write some personal thoughts just for you. I have things I want you to know to carry you through the coming years. There are also things I think you should do to keep your mind sharp and to continue to grow through the unusual life you have ahead of you. Do you understand what I mean?" Michael dropped his head down on his arms, crossed over his knees. "Michael, I would give you time to absorb all this, but oddly enough, time is something we don't have right now." All right, scene break, and we go to a letter. "I hope this finds you well, Father. My love to Mom, Donovan, and Adam. Tell Adam it wasn't his fault that I was picked. He was only a boy, and that guilt is too much for someone his age to carry. Tell the same to Donovan. Let Mom know that everything was fine. Waking up is always confusing. You got to experience it once. I wonder if it is harder after so much time, but I think you have it easier than I ever did. There are things you need to know about the world." Okay, back to the story. Michael sat on the padding inside the open sleep chamber. He stared at the floor in the darkness of the basement. He figured out where he was and that a year had passed, but there was a thickness to his thoughts and a bad taste in his mouth. Shallow lights flickered on the bar along the wall near the ceiling in response to his motion. He thought about being 12, but he supposed he was really the same age as when he lay down with the rest of the family in stasis a year before waking up again alone. He was 11 plus a few confused minutes. He stepped onto the floor. He stepped out onto the floor and stumbled. He tried to stand again, but then toppled onto his hands and knees. Something stuck his palm. He pulled at it and saw the broken piece of toothpick between his fingers. He breathed out all his air in a sudden rush of sorrow. It took him several seconds to regain his breath and then cry for a while longer. Michael pulled himself up onto the side of the stasis chamber next to him and looked down through the plastic canopy into the colorless face of his father. Michael's lips quivered. He pounded his fists against the plastic once. The sound was deep and vibrated through the chamber. His father did not move. He beat both fists against the plastic over and over. "Look at me. Open your eyes and look at me. Wake up and look at me." Michael heaved for air and dropped back to his knees on the stone floor. He shivered against the cold in the stone and in the air. He crawled over to the supply cabinet and pulled out a synthetic blanket. As he wrapped up in it, he stood without holding on to the cabinet. He stared at the metal doors at the end of the bunker. There was a suit and a breathing hood hanging next to it. Michael thought about his soft blanket on his bed, past 2 doors and up 2 flights of stairs. His father had told him the natural fibers would decay over time and possibly carry disease. Everything in the bunker was built for time and health. "You snooze, you lose," Michael said. Michael coughed on the taste of his own breath. He filled a cup with cycled water and drank. He coughed again. He pulled the silver package off the top of the stack in the cabinet. He set it on the plastic table and pulled the cord that activated the chemical cook. As the package sizzled and expanded behind him, he went to each of the chambers besides his own and pressed the restart button. "Keep sleeping, dummies." He picked up the notebook his father had written a year ago and looked through the instructions. This is going to be a long couple days. Okay, back to the letter. Time has a way of destroying in subtle and bold ways. It has a potential to heal, but that requires a little more care, I've discovered. Life is fragile, but it holds on and takes root. You could have taken the short straw shift. We could have learned farming without you. I've discovered this in my strange life also. Back to the story. Michael sat up on the edge of his open chamber. He waited patiently for the fog to clear in his awakening mind. He ignored the taste. He stood up before the lights flickered on. He walked down the line and punched the reset buttons on his family's chambers. He looked at the supply cabinets and then at the metal door with the plastic suit at the end of the bunker. Michael picked up the notebook his father had written 10 years earlier. At 2 or 3 days per shift, he had only been awake about 2 weeks total in that time. He set the notebook on the table. That's not long enough for things to get better. He felt along the walls and found the stress cracks he had been instructed to locate. Michael used the paste sparingly to seal the possible breaches in maintaining the integrity of the bunker. He put the paste away and took out a meal pack off the top of the stack. As he sipped water and set the package on the table, he stared at the door again. "I'm going." Michael pulled on the filter suit for the first time in 10 awakenings. He pulled down the hood and checked the seals twice. There hasn't been enough time to change anything. His voice sounded strange to him inside the mask. He placed his hand on the handle to the metal door. He listened to his own breathing through the respirator without opening the door. He turned and looked at the 4 closed and 1 open stasis chambers. If he didn't come back, the resets would automatically wake his family in 2 years. He picked up the broken piece of toothpick from the edge of a shelf near the door. It wasn't easy with the thick rubbery gloves of the suit. He turned the knob and stepped out into the barren basement. There was some clutter along the walls, but the room was sealed floor to ceiling. He should have brought a flashlight. There was some light coming from the tiny glass plate in the door across the room. Michael walked slowly through the outer basement. His toe kicked something on the dark floor. It moved away and came back to his foot. He could hear his breathing become harsh in his own ears. He kicked it again and tried to look down. He could only see a flash of motion, but he heard the metal clatter across the room. He forced himself to cross the room and pawed at the second door until he found the handle. He was too short to see out the window plate. It was thick, and at his angle, he only saw a twisted, swirling image of the ceiling outside. Michael pushed down on the handle and listened to the seal crack. It was muffled through the mask, but he heard the air rush. He felt it lightly passing over the skin of his suit. He couldn't tell if air was rushing in or rushing out. After a pause, he pulled the door open and stepped through to the base of the stairs that He felt like he had walked down for the last time just 2 weeks earlier. He lost his grip on the door as he stared. The door latch reconnected loudly behind him, but he did not react. It has changed. I should be 21? Michael stared up at the sky through the decayed boards of the second floor and a section of collapsed roof. Pink insulation spilled over what used to be the attic and in what used to be his house. It was daytime, but the sky was sick and brown. Water dripped over the boards and onto the blackened stairs. He held the stone on both sides and walked up the stairs to the main floor. The boards were soft and threatening under his feet. He emerged on the peeling linoleum and curled ends of floorboards. The only sign of life was what was growing around the edges of the refrigerator. He walked through the house, listening to the glass from the empty window frames crunching under his feet. The front door stood open and the frame was warped into a shape Michael didn't recognize. The dirt outside was flat gray and no plants in sight. Poison clouds rolled across the brown sky. That's why we locked ourselves in the basement and drew straws. Michael went upstairs into his room. He felt something crack in the floor under him and he reached for the bubbling drywall. He kept walking. Fiberglass insulation covered most of the furniture in his room. He swept the pink wads off the chair and then the rotten pillows. Underneath was his blue fuzzy blanket. He picked it up slowly, letting it unfurl. He looked around for black mold but didn't see any. He picked a couple pieces of insulation out of the material. Michael started to try to rub it against his face but stopped. He looped it over his shoulder next to his mask. The floor was spongy and weak under him. He walked over to his desk and placed the tiny piece of toothpick on top above the lap drawer. It rolled into the arm of an M he had carved into the surface. He had gotten spanked for that when he was 7. Now the desk was peeling from acidic rain spilling out of the open ceiling. He looked up at the sky through the broken roof and insulation. Who are you going to spank now for this, Dad? There was a crackling under his feet. Michael picked his way back across the room. A board snapped completely under him. He lifted his foot back out slowly and then continued to the doorway. He looked back at the desk. He could see the M, but not the toothpick. You rot just like the rest of this place. Michael went back down the stairs and stopped at the shelves in the living room. They were pulling away from the walls under the weight of the books. His father had downloaded what he considered important into the reader. Michael ran his fingers inside the gloves over the spines and covers. A few of them came apart in wet clumps. Others did not, and he picked a few from the dry survivors. Back down at the door to the outer basement, Michael reached for the handle, but found a keypad instead. He dropped all the books and his hand shook. I don't remember the code. I don't know the numbers. He put his hand over the pad and stopped. I'm stuck out here forever. After a moment, he punched in 4 numbers from muscle memory and heard the latch give. He pushed the door open and retrieved his books. Back to the letter. I had to figure out how to solve problems myself, and you will too. Things fall apart if you ignore them. That goes for buildings, gardens, and family. If you are not watching, someone else or something else has to. And back to the story. Michael blinked awake and pushed open the hatch. He swung his legs over the side and waited. When the lights came on, he was fine. He walked to the counter and lifted the soft blue blanket he got from the previous year's awakening. He smelled it and had a musty odor he didn't remember from when he went into stasis again, which only felt like a moment ago. He considered putting it in the chamber with him, but thought better of it. He wrapped the blanket around himself and pushed the resets on the other 4 chambers. He followed the instructions of his father's notebook again. The pages were starting to yellow. He thought about typing them into the reader his father had loaded books on for Michael. After he ate, Michael suited up and walked into the outer basement. This time he remembered the flashlight. He looked down at the casing of the light as he swept the beam from side to side. How long will you last? He spotted the bucket he had kicked a year ago. He kicked it again and let it bound out of the field of light. He heard the scuttling as he continued for the door. When the sound didn't stop, he did. Michael turned the light through the decayed paper and neglected debris around the walls. Something moved through the shadows. He brought the beam back, but the creature was gone. He turned the light onto the bunker door. It was sealed, but if rodents got into the outer basement, it might be a matter of time. That could be disastrous in terms of food and equipment. What should have been a 2 or 3 day shift turned into a 2-week adventure trying to figure out where the rats had entered the basement. Michael finally settled for digging out traps from the cabinets in the garage. The vehicles had been broken down for parts, scrap metal, and petty cash years before the family entered the bunker. The oil stains were still on the concrete below the sagging ceiling. He sacrificed a few scraps of his food and caught a couple. He sealed off their holes with a mix a little stronger than the paste. After some deliberation, he used some wood from the house upstairs to cook the rat for fresh meat. He could tell it didn't taste like chicken, but his body craved it. He returned to the bunker after another day, making sure he hadn't missed any holes. He pulled the cord on one more Kim Cook meal. As it expanded and sizzled, he calculated that his extra days of rat hunts had used up 6 years' worth of shift supplies. I need to learn how to farm. His voice echoed back from the walls in a way that scared him. He wrapped in the blue blanket, waiting for the food to digest before he went back under. The blanket smelled like sweat instead of musty age. It itched his neck in a way that made him suspect that there was still some insulation in it. He took the time to count the meal packs. The number of potential years was mind-boggling. He opened the seed cases and looked at what would be planted after the earth had healed itself and his family woke up. He dug a package out from the side that wasn't labeled. The seeds looked like small acorns. He only knew them from pictures his parents had shown him. He decided to take one out, and he suited up again. Upstairs, Michael walked out the front door under the brown sky. He walked about 50 steps out into the dirt. Part of the road was still visible through the erosion and mudslides. He clawed at the gray ground with the gloved fingers of his protective suit. He dropped the acorn in the shallow hole and scraped the dirt back over it. Michael stood a while longer staring at the disturbed earth. He looked around for something to mark the spot for when the rain smoothed it back down over the next year. There were corners of trash peeking out of the dirt. Michael listened to his breathing and the respirator as he thought about it. If it doesn't grow, then it doesn't matter where the seed is planted, he supposed. He turned around and took 3 steps back toward the house. Something moved around the corner behind the garage. He froze. His breath became more rapid as he waited. You're just seeing things. He waited for another few seconds, and then he ran for the door. All right, back to the letter. We should have been fixing things all along together. This did not have to take as long as it did. All right, back to the story. Michael sat up on his open stasis bed, but kept his eyes closed. He saw the lights come on through his lids, but he still didn't open them. He licked at his teeth until he couldn't taste them any longer. He wrapped up in the synthetic blanket and hit the resets on the other pods. He set the foam roll back out to have it ready for his mattress for the next couple nights. He made another scratch on the wall with a ceramic shard he had brought in from the outer basement years ago. He counted them by fives twice. He nodded. I'm 12 today, sort of. He began to suspect that he was aging faster from the wear of going in and out of stasis every year. He ran through his chores and then suited up. The first trip outside each shift had become his favorite part of waking. He crossed the outer basement in the dark. He had swept it clean several shifts ago, so there was nothing to kick. He opened the second door on darkness again. He felt in front of him until he found the flat footholds cut into the dirt where the stairs used to be. Michael climbed slowly and then pushed open the trap door he had built using scrap wood, torn plastic, and clay. He stepped outside and then closed the cover to camouflage the hole and slope leading down to the bunker. One corner of the old house still stood a story and a half off to the left. Most of it was crumbling away and partially buried. Michael turned and walked out to the tall oak. The trunk had been too thick for him to wrap his arms all the way around for years, but he hugged it again anyway. His fingers felt something odd, and he walked around the tree to check. The scars in the bark ran in sets of 4 parallel lines. He followed them up the trunk. He found a section higher on the tree where the bark had been torn away completely. It's not rats. A bear? Or a lion? Michael stood back from the tree and stared for a while. He looked around the ground, but it was hard-packed and left no prints. He looked from the tree up to the brown sky. It had not changed. He tried to remember the shift number. 104 years. It hasn't changed yet. He looked at the claw marks in the bark of the oak he had planted from a tiny acorn on a whim over 90 shifts ago. He looked on the ground again and knelt down. There was a tiny green sapling sprouting just a few inches out of the ground. He looked from the new growth to the sick sky again. Michael kept staring up as he pulled off the hood to his suit and smelled the dusty air without a filter. If whatever clawed this tree can breathe, then I can too. He imagined a giant rat with superhuman intelligence, but then erased the thought. 104 years is not long enough to evolve. He walked back down to the trap door and went down below to find something on the reader pad that he hadn't read yet. Okay, back to the letter. You did not think this through. What good is a couple that is beyond childbearing and their 3 sons going to do with the world anyway? We were so careful to stay quiet about our plans. We scrounged and gathered, we plotted and conspired, but to what end? We should have been in contact with others trying to do the same as us. We should have pooled our efforts with others. There is no honor in building a life for ourselves beyond the twilight of man, where we grow old and die with no future. You should have thought this through more. You should have. Back to the story. Michael could hear his breathing through the respirator as he descended the stone stairs. Bits of smoldering conflagulant dropped away from his torch as he approached the door. The door hung on one hinge and was twisted back out into the floor. The concrete block was broken away and crushed into powder like someone had remodeled the wall with a sledgehammer. Wires that connected to some other equipment between the door and the wall were exposed from the cracked frame. He whispered into his respirator hood, "This can't be good." Michael stepped over the door and the concrete block. He swept the torch out in front of him. 11 chambers lined the walls of this bunker. You all were a little smarter, sort of. He checked each one. In some cases the hatches to the stasis chambers were broken off the pods. The bodies inside still lay in place. A couple were twisted up on their sides, but most still stretched out like they never woke up. They had the same 4 parallel claw marks through their clothes and torn chests. Some of them were skeletons, others were mummified. He found one empty chamber hanging open and unscratched. Did you escape? Michael searched through the cabinets and containers. Food packs were torn open. The seeds and packs were missing from the plastic. On one wall, he found chalk marks faded into the stone in sets of 5, just like the ones he had scratched with his shard. Were you counting the days like me, or the years for the earth? Water marks from the cracks at the top of the wall had washed away both sides of the count, so there was no way to total up the marks. He turned to leave and then saw it in the corner. The little body curled into a ball, and there wasn't much left. Michael dropped down to one knee in his protective suit in front of the remains. I guess you drew the short straw. At this point, your whole family drew the short straw. I've been alone for 500 shifts. I'm about 16 years old and 1 month at the days out of the chamber count. My suit doesn't even fit me anymore. I'm wearing my dad's clothes and suit from the supplies. I don't even wear it outside usually, but I didn't know what I might find on this journey. I'm sorry I waited 500 years to come looking for you. I'm not sure what I could have done, but you wouldn't have been alone at least. Michael stood up and started to go. He stopped with his back to the body in the corner. He didn't look back once he started to speak again. This isn't your fault. I don't know what creature that 4-clawed monster is. I don't think it's a bear or a lion. I don't think anything new has had time to evolve, but who knows in this nasty world? I guess you know now, and it was the last thing you saw. Michael looked over to the far wall again and decided to search through the personal items before he left. Most had not survived 500 years. He loaded the synthetic blankets and respirator suits into his heavy pack. I'm not sure what I'll use these for, but who knows? Maybe I'll build a fort. You weren't the only ones. I found 3 others bunkers over the last few months. This is the 4th bunker I found. One was attacked like this one. Another was destroyed by a fire or explosion. There was one that was abandoned. The chambers were all open. The cabinets were empty. The door to the bunker was just hanging open. There was this weird note or poem on the wall, and it, Michael stopped talking as he lifted a book out of the container. It was still wrapped in plastic. The plastic was yellowed and stiff. The book inside was intact. A black and white picture graced the cover's dust jacket. It showed people planting trees. The title read, "Reclaiming the Desert, the Power of Planting Trees in Israel." I haven't read this one. I guess you haven't either. Michael stuck it into his pack. He looked for a reader or any other electronics that he might have survived, but again, there was none. Michael walked back out through the broken door. I'm sorry this happened to you. I'm sorry your family slept while you suffered. He held the torch out as he climbed back up the stone steps towards the yellow sky. All right, back to the letter. There is something out here with us. I don't even know how to explain it. I understand it a little better than the first time I saw it. The world is pushing back against us. I'm not sure if it blames us, but they sure do not like us. I discovered that over and over again in year 500 and in years since. I searched out nearly 100 miles in every direction for months. We should have done something about it centuries earlier. They planted trees in Israel. They used tourists to do it. They actually changed the climate by planting enough of them. They changed the rate of rainfall. In ancient times, the land was full of trees they used to build temples. It became a desert, and they actually began to reverse the process. Our air was breathable the whole time. I read much of the oxygen comes from ocean algae even before we killed off most everything else. We just needed to clean up our mess. Okay, back to the story. Michael jumped off the stasis bed before the lights came on. He wavered with dizziness, but he fought through it. The lights flickered on as he finished resetting the other chambers. He changed into work clothes he had cut and sewn out of the extra synthetic blankets. They itched a little, but they did keep the sweat away from his body. The other materials weren't holding up well once they were removed from storage. The blankets looked the same as they had almost 600 years ago. He grabbed the tools and pack he needed. He left the bunker and out the door to the end of the outer basement. He climbed up and out of the entrance to the cave. The grove of oaks greeted him at the entrance with shade. He took a deep breath. The unfiltered air was still dusty, but it was easier to imagine freshness in the grove of trees. He walked out and leaned on the grow box he had cut out of the first oak when it had finally fallen. There were fresh scratch marks on the outside of the box. The small plants and saplings inside weren't touched. This doesn't make sense. Are you a meat eater? You just came looking for little piggies sleeping in bunkers? You haven't figured out your way through my cave in camouflage? I find that hard to swallow, Fourclaw. Michael checked the cabin he used when he was out on the surface. The scratches there were the same ones from the previous year. The bunk still stood. He rolled out the foam from the bunker out on it to sleep. You stood for one more year. Good work. He went out to a fresh patch of gray dirt and began cutting out a curved trench. About mid-afternoon, he went and sat with his back to the outside wall of the cabin. He took a meal out of his pack and pulled the cook cord. He waited while it expanded on the grass next to him. Pecan trees need more water, he said out loud. We have to set them up for success. He heard the rumble like an approaching truck. He ignored it at first, but then his mind kicked him up out of his half-consciousness. He opened his eyes and stood up next to the cabin. Dust billowed up in the distance. Michael didn't know whether to run, hide, or prepare to fight, so he just stood staring. As it got closer, a mound of dirt rose and traveled like a trail through the grove. Burrowing, Michael said. Why haven't I seen those trails before? What are you? He picked up the trudging tool, still caked with gray dirt, and braced himself. The claws emerged first. They locked onto the surface and began to pull loose from the ground. Michael turned and ran before he saw what it was. Back to the letter. It should have been you. You should have manned up and did this job yourself. We should have all taken the short straw and did the work together. If I had a son, I would not have made him do what you placed on me. Most of my life was lived in lonely bursts. I aged in scattered days. The unnatural sleeping and waking was hard on me mentally and physically. Your choice was not brave. I hope you do better by my brothers once you are awake again. You owe me that after what you put on me. I provided a life for you to spend out your days as a family. It took more than waiting. Enjoy the labor of my hands and live your life worthy of this gift. Hopefully this is not the final whimper. There are more things you need to know. I've written the rest of it in the cabin outside. Obviously you don't need the protective suits. I've cut them up and used them for other things years ago. I'll see you outside. Michael. Okay, back to the story. He sat up on the edge of his stasis bed and blinked. The light wasn't right. He felt hot, like he had a fever. Dad, there's a note tied to your bed. Donovan pulled it loose and handed it to his father. He felt it between his fingers. Dad was printed on the outside. It wasn't paper. It felt like leather or parchment. He unrolled it and began to read it from the light coming from his left. Adam said, My mouth tastes like poop. Don't talk like that, their mother scolded. What happened? Donovan walked through Mr. Gage's light briefly. Was there an explosion? Mrs. Gage said the counter says we've been under for... Oh my God, that can't be right. Mr. Gage started to read the letter once again. A breeze blew past his face and he panicked. Don't open the door, we don't know what's out there. Donovan laughed. Dad, there is no door. Gage stood up on his wobbly legs and stared out through the open space where the front wall used to be. He stared through a cavern with a wide mouth opening to the bright outside. What happened? He went around to the end of his stasis pod to check the counter, but it wasn't there. The wires were pulled out and reconfigured in a way that he didn't recognize. Corrosion from the elements spread over the wires in the outside of the pod. What did you do, Michael? Donovan said, I'm going outside. Wait, Mr. Gage shouted. We'll all go. Follow me behind me. They left the stone bunker and walked along the packed dirt toward the entrance of the cave. The light blinded. Mr. Gage whispered, How long? What? How long did your counter say we were under? She cleared her throat. It said thousands of years. They stepped outside and shielded their eyes from the sun. All right. I know I'm kind of being a tease, but I'm going to stop there and give everyone the opportunity to pick up my favorite story from Penn Presents podcast author anthology. There are many, many great stories in there, including the ending to the story I was just reading. Again, that is my favorite story. It's definitely my favorite science fiction story I've written. I don't want to give away the ending because I think for the purpose of the anthology, Armand would appreciate it if I kept an incentive to go out and buy it. But themes that I was dealing with in that story included family and dealing with fathers, and a lot of my fiction tended to move that direction, partly because of my relationship with my father, but then becoming a father myself and trying to do right by my kids and all the difficulty that comes with that. And I just kind of liked, I was playing at the time, this story was written quite a while ago, playing at the time with how stasis would work, what would that look like. Obviously there's environmental issues in there, whether you agree with those topics or not. I think I handled them pretty well in the story, and kind of creates a theme, and I do like how it ends if you're interested in checking out the anthology. Again, that's Project Entertainment Network, Penn Presents My Favorite Story, and several authors in there, much better than me, did that. But again, I think that story is one of my better ones that I have in there. Thank you for listening in this week, and I will talk to you again next week. Okay, as I said, this video is going to appear, I believe, on the Project Entertainment Network Patreon page before it airs in August. So people on there will get a chance to see it, and then of course anybody that caught it here on Twitch will as well. So anybody that dropped in, I appreciate it, and I will talk to you guys again sometime soon. Alright, let me see if I can figure out how this turns off.